All right. So as Pam indicated, this talk was sort of bulleted as a keynote address, which makes me think of big lofty things. But really, what I'm here to do today, and what all of us are here to do today, is to provide some really concrete, actionable things that you can bring into your classroom in the fall, or heck, even right now, if you're still scrambling to do some summer teaching. So I'm hoping that I can be successful in doing that for you. And you'll notice that my title says starting from scratch. And this harkens back to what Quinn just said. When, in the spring, we were all faced with, oops, let's see if I can do this properly. In the spring, before I hop in, I wanted to say that this is a conversation. And so at any point, if you want to be participating, I invite you to do that, to share your expertise, because I know there's a lot in this Zoom room. And many of you are already experts at Zoom, but for those of you who might be a little bit newer to Zoom, I thought I'd introduce you to some features of our Boeing 747. I want you to notice that your window will look a little bit different, but somewhere along the bottom or along the top, there's going to be a participants icon, and you can use that to raise your hand. That's probably going to come in better in the smaller groups. In this larger forum, I'll have the participants page open, but I'm not sure I'll see raise hand. So you can also just use the chat feature and type in hand if you want to let me know that you have something you want to say, or you can just ask a question. And if I don't see it, feel free to use this as a back channel throughout the keynote so that you can answer one another's questions. And I'll skim it when we have breaks to see if I can weave things in. But we can use this as fodder for talk. Incidentally, I use this in my own classroom when I'm teaching synchronously on Zoom for just that reason. It's a back channel that students can use to clarify if they miss something and answer one another's questions. And it also allows me to see if there are issues that I'm missing or need to review quickly. So keep in mind that that's a way you could use it too as an instructor. All right, so starting from scratch. This spring, this was kind of my pre-pandemic learning environment, and yours might have looked something similar, but the idea being that I had a real nice relationship with my students. We were doing active things in the classroom. I was stoked, they were stoked, and we were doing great things. And then the pandemic happened, and suddenly I was transitioned to this kind of learning environment. And I'll say that for me personally, the transition from one to the other wasn't all that bumpy. And that was because I'd spent a lot of time in the fall and in the spring developing a relationship with my students that allowed me to already have the trust and rapport to do an experiment and kind of make mistakes in the online environment without inhibiting what was happening for their learning. But now we're going into the fall and we don't have the luxury of kind of coasting on our fumes, if you will. And so this keynote is really structured around having us reflect on our wealth of experiences of developing a positive learning environment in our in-person classroom, and then translating that to create a similar positive learning environment online. And so what I'm really hoping that you'll realize at the end of this talk is that you already have a lot of these skills. It just requires a little bit of creativity and a little bit of willingness to take a risk. And I think you'll have the same results in your online classroom. So this is my one nod to being interactive today, because I wasn't sure how my technology was going to work. But what I want you to think about for the next 45 seconds is I want you to think about your own online or your own in-person classes. And I want you to think about what are the hallmarks of a positive learning environment for you. So if you walk into your classroom or you walk into a colleague's classroom, what are the hallmarks of a positive learning environment? And I'll ask that you'll share those in the chat here for about 45 seconds. Okay, I have about 10 seconds left. And what I'm seeing here in the chat, there's a lot of stuff about, I can see student engagement, I can see students' faces, I can connect with them, I can see some evidence that there's inclusiveness and belonging in the classroom. And you know, when I think about what you're putting in the chat room, these are all things that we can visibly see or experience, which is difficult in the online world. You know, right now we're in a synchronous environment, and even this is awkward to feel how you're responding to what I'm presenting to you or how you're interacting with one another. And if I were to be doing this asynchronously, it would create its own challenges. But what I would like to posit to you is that in either of these learning environments where we're face-to-face or synchronous online or asynchronous offline, the way that we create that positive learning environment where we can see student engagement and we can connect with our students and they can feel included is by really thinking about these 4 principles. How do we make our space a place where students have a sense of belonging? All of our students. How do we set clear expectations so that they know how to engage in our classroom? How do we create routine and consistency, which also contributes to a positive learning environment? And how do we develop trust? So these are the 4 things I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to try and give you really concrete examples, but I invite participants to share their concrete examples as well, because these are just a tip of the iceberg and there's so many ways to approach this. And I'll also say that I'm a little bit biased right now to the kind of synchronous. A lot of my examples will be in the synchronous environment because I do team-based learning, but we have experts in this conference that know how to do this with just all online and asynchronous. So I'm looking to those folks to sort of pipe in as well. Let's share the expertise. So the first one, this first principle is a sense of belonging. And I want to talk first about the sense of belonging that gets created by the instructor. And the way that we can describe this sense of belonging that's created by the instructor is in terms of something called instructor immediacy. Instructor immediacy is a construct that comes from the field of communication and communication research. And really what it is it's all the verbal and nonverbal behaviors that an instructor exhibits that really helps those students feel a sense of closeness with their instructor and a sense of belonging. And there's a lot of research on the effects of instructor immediacy. So instructors who exhibit a lot of these behaviors that is correlated with higher levels of student motivation, student attendance and engagement. We also see it highly correlated with affective learning, so how students feel about their motivation and their self-efficacy, but also in their cognitive learning, just the content that they're learning. And also it's positively correlated with the students' evaluations of us as instructors. And there's newer research that's showing that it's positively correlated, or sorry, negatively correlated with issues of academic integrity. So the more immediate an instructor is perceived to be, the fewer academic integrity issues that arise. And if you're curious about reading more and more and more about this sort of research, a lot of this comes out from Dr. Del Gaizo's work at St. John's University. And she's kind of collected some of these references on the CERT website. And of course, these slides will be posted, so you don't need to be writing down websites. These will be posted for you afterward. Okay, great. So instructor immediacy, how do I do that? It's pretty easy when I'm in in-person classroom because I think about when I walk in during the day, I have those 5 to 10 minutes before class where I can work around and interact with students. There's lots of things I can do in my in-person classroom. I would say that we're going to do the same things for online or remote learning, and that is we're just creating those opportunities for informal interactions so that students can feel that instructor immediacy. And the way we do that is actually right now. So if you're not presently teaching and you're getting ready to teach this fall, You should be communicating with your students early and often. There are a lot of questions that our students are having about what the environment is going to look like, how their class is going to run, what the expectations are. And your institution may be sending big communication at the administrative level, but your students really want to know brass tacks, what's happening in your own classroom. And so talking to them about whether or not you're going to have an asynchronous environment, or if it's going to be synchronous, or if it's going to be a little bit of this or a little bit of that, helping them understand that ahead of time just shows that you care about them, and you can communicate why you're making the decisions that you're doing as an instructor, which also will help increase immediacy because it shows that you're thinking about your students and their needs. You can also do simple things like just personalizing your learning management system. And I know that different institutions allow you different amounts of freedom. At North Dakota State University, where I was before this, I could change the color of my learning management system, and I could create personalized banners. And I would really work hard, even though I was teaching a face-to-face course, to make my learning management system an online place where my students felt that they could gather, kind of like a water cooler or a water fountain where they might come to talk about things related to my biochemistry course. You can do that here as well, and think about creating spaces there for your students, but also like communicating to your students that you are a person. So telling them things about you so that they can start to see and connect with you on a more human level. And that means you might use the discussion board and have like a whole exercise where students are introducing themselves, not just the nuts and bolts stuff like their major and what they're hoping to get out of their class, but like really personal things. Not too personal, but personal, right? So on the first day of class, I might share with my students where I grew up in Montana, where I went to school, where I did my PhD, and then I'll share them some goofy photos of my kids and some of the hobbies that I do, right? I can still do that in an online environment. I can make a whole discussion board. James Hewlett at Fingers Lake Community College, who's a fabulous online instructor, really recommends creating a space in there where you invite students to ask questions about you. I mean, they can ask questions about the class, but just questions about you, like, what do you like to do on a Saturday? Where have you traveled? And all of that contributes to this sense of community and models to our students that we can have those conversations and be real with one another and increase that instructor immediacy. The other one I like to do is each day I like to provide a daily check-in. And of course I use Zoom because I'm doing a lot of synchronous teaching. You may be doing asynchronous teaching, but creating these places where students can know me as a person. So here's an example of even during the pandemic, I really wanted to have some takeout, and I actually don't eat out a lot during the normal school year, but I needed some normalcy. So I kept asking my students, what's the best place to eat in town? I would ask them for recommendations for movies for my kids. All of these things can break the ice, but help them feel like they're part of the classroom. And then the last one I did was recommend doing is pop-up office hours. So you will be thinking about in the fall how you want to structure your interactions with students and your availability. But the situation with the pandemic has created some interesting scheduling issues for our students. And so even though we're very available and make those office hours available to them at a regular time, I also was really responsive to my students when I would see on a discussion board where they were having problems with things. I would say, okay, you know what, tonight at 8 p.m. after I put my kids to bed, we're gonna do a pop-up office hour. Anybody who wants to show up can. I'll answer a bunch of those questions right then. Of course, I'll still have my regularly scheduled office hours, but you know, it seems like everyone is on right now and kind of having this discussion. So I wanna be able to have it live if we need to. Okay. So these are all things that we can do as an instructor to focus on instructor immediacy. But then I want to talk about like creating this space where it feels like an actual classroom or a place where they're going to go. Place is really important for students. In the K-12 literature, we see the importance of creating place. And teachers spend a lot of time personalizing that space because students are going to spend a lot of time there and they need to feel like they belong. We can do the same thing remotely. And it can start with things like personalizing Zoom. And a common complaint I hear from faculty is that in Zoom, like my students, I don't know if they're engaging or not. You know, half of them don't have their video on. Should I make them have their video on? Should I not? And I would say that there are some real reasons why students may not want to have their video on. They may not have the bandwidth to effectively do that. It's a very simple answer. But some of them are living in places which they may not want their peers to see where they're living, and if they feel like that's kind of a violation of privacy. So we create a way to have my students be present, but also respect their wishes to be private. And one of the ways I do that is I say, if you're not going to share your video, please personalize it by putting a picture up so I know what you look like. Please feel free to change how, you know, the Zoom name that gets put in there for you. I have the settings so that you can put your name, how you want to be called, not how it's on my roster, but how you want to be called. This is really important for students that I have who are transitioning. And also, if I'm going to have a lot of group work, I want to know what pronouns you want your classmates to use when they're interacting with you. So this is one way that I can personalize Zoom and help students know that this is a place for them, and that we're going to tailor it to meet them. I can also change this up to make it fun. So I can say, if you don't want to put a personal picture, maybe you put a picture of your hobby. So I tell students that one of my hobbies is to send my friends ridiculous garden gnomes that just randomly appear. And so this is my hobby. Or I can ask them around midterm, post a picture of how you feel right now. Are you feeling really anxious? Is there a monkey on your back? So there's ways to make Zoom playful and help them feel like it's a space for learning. You can have your students create a class playlist, a music list. So when they come on into the environment, that playlist is going, it's generated by them. You can have somebody be in charge of it. That's sort of the same thing that you might do in your own classroom, have music playing before class starts. I use a looping slideshow because students are coming into Zoom at various times. It's sort of like the announcement board in your learning management system, but I do a couple of things there. First, I tell them what we're going to be doing that day, but I also highlight upcoming events that can help support my students' learning. If there's seminars, if there's study sessions, whatever. But I also highlight their accomplishments. You know, personal things that I'm seeing in the school newspaper to celebrate them as humans. And finally, I make a student lounge in my LMS for students. And that takes a little bit of work. If you just create a link, students aren't going to use it. But early on in the beginning of this semester, you can talk about the student lounge. You can seed it with your teaching assistants or learning assistants and have them make it their
yeah, right.
And then they can use that to communicate to you kind of problems that they're having. I want to point out here that if you are using a student lounge, you do not have to feel like you're answering every single question. One of the things that we run into with online instruction is that we feel like we have to maybe respond to every student question or comment in the learning management system, but we don't need to do that. You can look for commonalities in what they're saying and then put a larger group response to say, oh, it seems like students are really grappling with this, these ideas about entropy. And so I really wanted to clarify this and direct you to some resources that can help you refresh your memory about what's happening. And then one of the things you can do is actually create that learning management system to find a place where students can study. So right now, many of our students aren't going to be on campus, or if they are, there's going to be limitations to how many students can meet face-to-face. This is particularly true for us in Washington because we're not even in stage 4. And so my intentionality is to create a space, much like the student union or the library, where my students can come and meet. And that means I'm going to be hosting Zoom rooms for them to use and breakout rooms for them to use and electronic whiteboards. Okay, so clear expectations is another thing that will help increase the positive learning environment in our classroom. And I think that when we think about instructors setting clear expectations, we immediately think about those expectations we have for learning and assessment. What is it that we want our students to know and be able to do by the end of a lesson, unit, or activity? And we think about how we want to teach them that stuff. And that is just as important in the online environment as it is in the in-person environment. What I am realizing is that when I say, what is it that I expect my students to know and be able to do, that verbiage isn't shared with other faculty sometimes. And so when I'm talking about what I want students to know and be able to do, I'm really thinking about more than just topic areas, right? I'm not looking at my syllabus and saying they need to know Henderson-Hasselbalch, but really I'm thinking about what are the overarching concepts that are really underpinning biochemistry and molecular biology, and how do they play out in each of the content or each of the chapters or units that I'm covering. And so if you don't have a lot of practice at articulating learning outcomes, ASBMB has been doing this for a long time. So I wanted to direct you all to the ASBMB website. If you didn't already know this was here, they have overarching concepts, foundational concepts for BMB, and then give you examples of these learning outcomes that you might use to communicate to your students what's happening. That's important because those learning outcomes then become the basis for what students do in your classroom and how they study. It helps make their time outside of class much more intentional and more highly engaged. We also want to be clear to them how we're going to assess them. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this because we have an afternoon session about assessment. And I'll touch a little bit on assessments throughout this, but really what is it that, how are you going to know if your students achieve the learning outcomes set out for them? And then finally, you want to talk to students about the nature of your instructional activities. Are you going to be posting some short lectures with a lot of like teamwork, or are there going to be regular homework assignments? What is that going to look like? Again, the more we can communicate with them, the more they can plan and the more they can take responsibility for their own learning. That piece that I just talked about really seems to come naturally to faculty because we do it all the time in our face-to-face instruction. We might need to tweak it a little bit for online. But now when we're thinking about transitioning to the remote learning environment, we have to think about how we want our students to engage in that space and how to help them make positive choices in how they're going to engage. So I'm going to give you an example from my class, which is a synchronous example. And I use team-based learning where students are broken up into permanent groups they work in all semester long. This last semester I had 15 groups of 5. I did them in Zoom. And we work on team exercises during class. And I utilize the breakout rooms to do that. Of course, if I want students to be able to work in a team online from day one, that means I have to set some expectations for how I want them to prepare for class and how I want them to engage. For those of you who are familiar with team-based learning, you know that there's an individual responsibility or assessment readiness process that students go through. And so they complete an online assessment that covers the material that we will be leveraging in class and applying to real meaty and unique and novel problems. And then when they come into their groups, they repeat that process to determine that the team is ready. And so I, as an instructor, can provide a mini lecture if there are pieces that are missing that they're going to need for that application thing. So, you know, communicating to my students that there is a rhythm to my course and a rhythm to how we're going to engage, and that the expectation is that they are going to have some individual responsibility and some team accountability is very important. But then the question might be, how do I really get them to dig in this like very impersonal setting? And again, this talks about like just very much making explicit to students what I think is common knowledge, but it's not always for our students, right? We as faculty probably have collaborators across the country, and we've been using these sorts of platforms to interact with folks. And so we know how to behave in these spaces. But for our students, it's not always obvious. So being very clear that we want them to join early, come to class early so that they can interact with one another, to remember that the remote environment is kind of cold and awkward. And so we actually have to make an extra effort to communicate that warmness and that humanity to one another. And that takes a little bit of effort. So we need to be extra specially cautious with our language and comments. We want to encourage students to turn on their video when they can. And so for my class, when there's 90 of them, they don't have to have their video on. But when then they're a small group of 4 to 5, I really encourage them to keep their video on because that's easy or helps them interact better, right? And so you can create this sort of visual cue, and you can have this as one of your slides that rotates through every day, you know, for the first few weeks to remind students, this is how we're going to interact. This is what we're going to do. These are the things that, how I want you to behave, so that there's real clear expectations for them. As an instructor, you want to clearly communicate to your students, just like you would any other time, what the rules of engagement are for you. So how frequently are you going to be checking your email and responding to student responses? I tell my students that I want to stay happily married. So that means that I can't respond to emails past a certain time of night and not before in the morning, but that I'm really attentive all other times. There's one other thing about that. Can't remember, darn. So just think about how you want them to interact with you. The other thing that's important is that in an online environment, if you were talking with a student in real life and they said something to you, you would acknowledge that they said something to you, right? Either like with a thanks for bringing that to my attention, or I'll get right back to you on that. It's the same courtesy in an online environment or via email, and it's even more important in this case. So if a student is reaching out to you and interacting with you, it's really important to acknowledge them, even if it's with something simple like thank you, or I got your email, I'll get back to it. We want to emulate that interaction with our students so they know we're attentive. Okay, routine and consistency. This is particularly important in the remote learning environment, because if our students are attending university and the majority of their courses are remote, or even a portion of them, they're really going to have to juggle a schedule in a way that they hadn't before. Okay. And so really communicating ahead of time when things are going to be happening is going to be important. And the reason why is because the more routine and consistency we have in our courses, the easier it becomes for our students to come up with a very productive schedule for learning. And so you can see, for example, a student might start filling out their day and what they need to do synchronously, what they need to do asynchronously, and really scheduling in that time for self-care that they need as well. Routine and consistency reduces anxiety from our students. So when you get those panicked emails from students, a lot of it comes from really legitimately not knowing what they're supposed to be doing. And I know that I'll hear faculty say, but it was in the syllabus. And I want to say that as a faculty member, there are lots of things that I get that were in that email, they were in that memo, they were in that document. I mean, this morning was a perfect example. Stephanie asked us a very particular way to put our name in on Zoom, and I blatantly didn't even see that in the email, okay? So it's human nature when you have a lot of things coming in. Even the most well-intentioned students might miss something that was in the syllabus on day one. But if we have a routine that they know every Monday the same thing happens, then that decreases anxiety because they've already planned for it. It's already embedded in their permanent schedule, and they can really accommodate that. Believe it or not, if we have routine and consistency, it increases time for instruction and learning, because we're not answering a bunch of emails and questions from students about when was this due? Oh, I missed that. Can I have an extension? Oh, I didn't understand the instructions. All of that stuff sort of goes away. And this is really substantiated by the literature in the K-12 realm, the importance and value of routine and consistency in reducing classroom management issues. And ultimately, it reduces distractions for our students, because if they can get this in ahead of time, they know when to study, how to study, and how to prepare themselves. What this does is it actually shifts ownership to our students. It places the responsibility for learning squarely on them. So again, an example from team-based learning is that I set reoccurring and predictable due dates for everything in my class. So my students know that every Sunday, so before every Monday and before every Friday in class, they will have to complete an independent readiness assessment, and it's due at the same time every week. And that every Wednesday we're going to have a quiz, and then every day that there's an independent, an IRAT, there's going to be a TRAP. So there's no question what's happening when. I'm also really attentive to setting deadlines in a very strategic way. And what I mean by that is, if I set a deadline at midnight, when are my students most likely to be working? 11 p.m., right before that deadline. And that's not the most productive time, I would argue, for most of our students' brains to be working. So I try to think about when to set those deadlines to increase the likelihood that they are engaging during times when their brains are active, well-fed, well-rested, and less stressed. So sometimes I'll actually send a poll out to my students ahead of time if it's a small enough class to find out when they, especially because I deal with majors at the upper division level, and I find out what their general schedules are. I find out what work things they have, and I find out kind of a window where I think that they're mostly all going to be productive. The other thing you can do is you can come up with a graphic organizer to communicate the rhythm of your course to your class. And I've stolen a lot of this stuff from Allison Finn and Jeremy Kerr. They're up in Ontario. They're chem ed researchers, and they're fabulous. And they've put together this entire guide with adaptable materials. So these are all things that you can adapt for yourself. But you can use a graphical organizer to communicate to your students how things are going to go in an asynchronous environment. Or you can talk to them about how it's going to work in a synchronous environment. And you can actually embed links into it with the course tools that you expect them to be able to use. So again, this can be something that's sitting in your learning management system that you revisit frequently to communicate to students. Okay, don't forget, this unit, we're starting with these learning outcomes. This is what I want you to know and be able to do. This is what you should be studying. Here's the way I'm going to deliver content to you. Here's how I'm going to give you, assess you formatively, and here's how I'm going to give you practice. Okay, and these are the time dates that are associated with it. Okay. I also think that it's important for our students, if we're teaching them earlier in the curriculum, our freshmen and sophomores, to provide some structure for them about how to really think about engaging with this course in amongst all their other courses. So you can do that by providing them graphical organizers ahead of time and making it an assignment if you want to. But here, you're really recognizing that your student is a whole person. This increases instructor immediacy. It increases a sense of belonging. But you can have them reflect on what they're going to do to be a successful learner. And if you want to, you can make this a contract, an informal contract between you and your student. So if they start to have problems later on, you can have them pull this out and you can say, well, when you filled it out, you said that you were going to take social media and news apps off of your phone. Have you done that? Oh, when you're studying, you're using Snapchat with your friends. Okay, let's start there. Maybe that's not the most productive way to work and get ready for the remote learning environment. Okay, or we can talk about, oh my gosh, how do we set boundaries with our family, or how do we work through these problems? So it's helpful for the student to make things explicit and come up with a plan, but also for them to reflect on their plans and how it relates to your class. The final thing to think about here is, how do we develop trust with our students? And the reason trust is important is because in the chat early on, we all remarked that one of the things that was a hallmark of a positive learning environment was student engagement, feelings of inclusivity, connection with our students. People were excited to learn and be there. And that's not going to happen without trust. And so one of the things we want to think about in the online learning environment is, how can we provide opportunities for students to really recognize common ground? So the research tells us that you're more likely to trust an individual or a stranger if there's some perceived similarities or some common ground that you have. And so I have this little image here to say, students could focus on the fact that there's apples and oranges and pears in the classroom and think that they really don't have anything to learn from anyone else and they're all on their own, or they can recognize they're all fruit and that they can leverage those similarities to start to garner some trust. So this kind of goes back to the instructor immediacy thing, where you're creating spaces for you to be vulnerable to your students and let them know something about you. You can create opportunities for them to be kind of vulnerable with one another. And I don't mean in a way that's going to be unsafe, but I mean a way that, you can ask them, what makes you most nervous about learning this way this semester? And what are you doing to blow off steam during COVID? And these conversations in that informal discussion space can help them start to develop the trust that they need in order to interact with one another in the learning environment that you create. We also need to spend some time talking to our students about the importance of taking risks and how they're productive for student learning, and then provide opportunities for them to make those small risks and fail at some of them and realize it wasn't such a big deal. And so I often talk to my students that I want to give them all sorts of opportunities to make mistakes in class before they take the exam or the assessment, because that's how they're going to learn. And importantly, I want them to take these kind of mistakes, and they're going to need one another to make those stretching kind of mistakes, because even though I've been teaching forever, and even though I try and know exactly what's in their head, I know this material. I don't remember where every little tiny stumbling block is, but their peers do. So if they work together to help each other stretch and push, they're going to learn more. And so I create lots of opportunities for small group work and small interaction, whether it be synchronously or asynchronously, so they can make those mistakes and learn that no one's going to ridicule them in that process, and learn that everyone's going to celebrate the fact that they made a mistake and learn from it. The other thing that is important is to clarify norms, expectations, and roles. And I believe that this is important in all classrooms, but again, particularly important in an environment where we're hoping that students will be interacting with one another. One of the ways that I do that, there's several ways. I have done things like have my students generate a class code of conduct, a class contract. We do that over the first 2 days, where we talk about what our rules of engagement are going to be, what our expectations are, and what the consequence of that is. I draw it up in a contract. I have students vote on it, and that becomes our living document. For my class with team-based learning, they have to be interacting with one another all the time, and they have to be challenging each other all the time, every day. And that creates a sense of vulnerability, right? It also creates an opportunity for some people to be taking over the conversation and really keep leaving others behind. And so what I do on day one is I ask my students in groups to create name placards. And this is where I use the little name part at the bottom of Zoom. But I ask them, here's a list of constructive behaviors, and here's a list of destructive behaviors that people exhibit in when they're interacting with others, in teams in particular. And I don't have everything here. Usually there's a description about what we mean by these. They're pretty self-explanatory. And I say, I want you to think for a second about your own tendencies in a group, and I want you to identify your #1 constructive behavior, like that you've got in your wheelhouse. And then I want you to write that down, like either on a piece of paper or in the Zoom window or in the chat with your small group. Then I want you to think about, what's a destructive behavior that you do? Like Offerdahl's destructive behavior is digressing. Like, I like to be the clown, and it's not productive. And I'm constantly working on that. I'm also a dominator. If I think I know it, I'm a know-it-all. And those are those are pretty not okay behaviors if I'm trying to include everyone in the conversation. And so, a few minutes for them to reflect independently, but then I have them share out what their constructive is and what their destructive is. And then together they look at, okay, what is the suite of constructive behaviors we have in this group? Together, we're going to draft a plan for how we're going to increase the likelihood of all of these constructive behaviors. And we're going to talk about how we're going to minimize the destructive behaviors. And then those groups, when I bring them out of the breakout session, we have a share out session where we talk about their plans. And it's phenomenal, because these teams then, after the first day, have already talked about what makes them nervous about working in a group. They've already set the norm for how they're going to talk and communicate with one another. And they've already come up with a plan for how they're going to self-regulate. I've used this in person, and I'm using it online, and it's really a great way for them to set norms for small group work in class. So, there's lots of resources out there for folks to look at and try, but this is just some of them. I should have shared this slide. This is what I was going to do. The final thing to remember is that teaching is really human. And our students are just like us. They didn't sign up for a pandemic, and they didn't necessarily sign up for the type of learning environment that they're going to be in. And we're all here because we're kind of trying to figure out how to do it best. And I invite you to consider that your students are doing the same thing. And if you view your students from that perspective, from the we're all in this together, that they have the best intentions for learning, that will get communicated to your students in a way that engenders this really positive learning environment. And it will translate to really good learning outcomes for you and your student. So if we can't coast on our fumes, what can we do? I hope I gave you some ideas, and I admit I was really bad at following along in the chat. So I'm gonna give an opportunity to let folks formulate their question if we have any time left, and I'm gonna kind of open up the chat and skim. Maybe.
Thank you, Erika. That was a great talk. Like a lot of people have been taking pictures. I've been writing things down. I just want to make sure everybody knows this will be posted, will be available to access. So thank you for an excellent talk. Appreciate it. Are there any questions we have before we go to the breakout? While we're waiting, I will say we're going to break out into 2 groups after this. We're going to have a biochemistry lab session, and then we're going to have a molecular biology lab session. And so if you're in the biochemistry group, you'll be staying in this room. If you're in the molecular biology group, you'll be going to a breakout, a different room as a breakout. And we'll have talks there. So just be aware. After that, we'll have a 15-minute break, so you can kind of stop staring at a computer for a while. And then we'll come back and we'll have more talks. So, you know, this is a great kickoff. I'm very excited about this. So thank you. Okay, so all I've gotten is just praise. So excellent. This is very good.
I'm trying to read through the comments to make sure I didn't miss anything. So if there was something, Diane, that you wanted to know, that's fine, but we can also just take a break. And I really appreciate everyone who put resources in the chats, and you have fantastic ideas. There was one question, how do I assign groups? I do it with an eye toward diversity. I set students that are, I make the groups as diverse as possible, but also making sure that there's not a lone underrepresented student in any group. And I do that ahead of time. I get their information from the registrar.
Erika, this is Pam. I think there was a question early on about shy students. Yeah. And how to handle shyer students.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because we know from some of the research that's coming out from Sarah Brownell's group at Arizona State University that students who are shy or students who experience high levels of anxiety, these sorts of like very active environments can be anxiety producing and also lead to disengagement. I had a few students, I asked them before we went into the remote environment, I gave them a survey. I said, how many of you like really feel like this is going to give you the heebie-jeebies? That this is going to make you not want to come to class, and be honest, so that we can work around that. And so for most of them, what they were nervous about, what I learned was that they were nervous about showing their homes. They were nervous about having to be in the video. They were fine with participating in small groups as long as they could do it by voice. And so I helped facilitate conversations in the small groups about how that might look for those students without saying, my shy student doesn't want to participate. We just said, okay, you know, we have technology and bandwidth issues, and some of us may not be able to participate in that way, so how can we participate? But a survey really helped, and I was really upfront with students. I get that this is going to be anxiety producing for some of you, so to help me understand what the issues are so we can work around them.
There's a question about optimal group size and how to do online quizzes.
So optimal group size, the research is still out on that. There's a lot of conflicting research. I like 5. No, I don't like greater than 5. The reason I like 5 is that if somebody misses, I still have enough that there's a good conversation happening. So, and then quizzes, online quizzes, was that a question?
Right, just how to do it and how to TRAT.
I use Blackboard. So they do everything on Blackboard. When they're in their breakout room, one of them shares their screen. It's on Blackboard. They all answer the same assessment together, but they're sharing their screen in Zoom and complete it. So, you know, in a real classroom, you might use those scratch off if that cards, but I use Blackboard. And I like that too, because then I can see how they did, right? As soon as they all submit, I can see the distribution, which is the if that I actually have to calculate it on my own, and I'm slow and old. Yeah. Okay. I think we're moving on to the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, Erica. And just